Hello, welcome to the Jacksonville History Show. I'm Emily Rutherford-Liska, Executive Director of the Jacksonville Historical Society. This is the show that analyzes and celebrates North Florida's history. And we welcome you here today, and in particular, welcome Jeffrey Spears, who is the author of the recently published cookbook, the First Coast Heritage Cookbook. And it is a great read as well as a book with great recipes. And I want to hold it up. I hope they've got you on camera now, Jeffrey, but I'd like to hold this book up and maybe get a close-up right at the beginning. Here you go. There you go. And this is the wonderful book. And a few nights I just sit in bed, the reading light on, and I have thoroughly enjoyed the history that you've dished up, as well as these wonderful recipes. So tell us about the reason you decided to write this book.
Well, first I want to thank you for having me on. This is a great pleasure.
You're welcome.
I was struck, I've lived in Jacksonville nearly three years now, and I'm trained in the culinary arts. I'm not a chef, but I'm trained. And I was struck by the fact someone told me that there were no oranges here when Florida was first settled and that the Spanish brought them in. I go, what do you mean there were no oranges here? No citrus. And so I'm going to look into this. And sure enough, the Spanish brought in the oranges and the grapefruit and the lemons and the limes. All of this came in from Hispaniola. And I was just fascinated by this history thing. It caught me. And so I started doing the research, and I was looking for a book to write. And
because you'd previously written.
Yeah, I have another cookbook out.
And what is
this
that?
This one's called Yum. Oh, I always get it screwed up.
It's your book.
I know it is. Culinary. Tasty Treats from Culinary Greats. It's a compilation book. It's recipes from chefs all over the country. We've got
wonderful.
Yeah, we've got people in the best of their field, from California to New York. We've got a guy from Hawaii, Roy Yamaguchi. You might know Roy's Restaurants. He contributed a recipe, and just a lot of really great names. But it's out of print now, and you can probably find it on Amazon or somewhere. But we wanted to do another book.
Okay.
So, and just the history of the culinary influences here on the First Coast caught my fancy. And so here we are.
Well, this is exciting. Now, I want you to describe, I'm going to pull a little bit more out of you about why you wrote it and your route, but talk a little bit about this book and the period you covered. And there are going to be a lot of people watching who will be surprised by this.
Yes. Well, I wanted to find a span of time that is not, there are lots of Southern cookbooks out there, and there are lots of regional cuisine cookbooks out there, but there's nothing about how these foods got here, nothing about the origins. And I looked in some history books, and archaeological evidence tells us that, and depends on which book you read, but either 12,000 or 14,000 years ago, that's the first evidence of human habitation along what is now the Floridian Peninsula. These were the Indians that migrated from Asia over the Bering Straits, worked their way through North America, and ended up down in Florida, and simply called them the Timucua, if you will, or the Satariba, or whatever tribe you want to call, but you got the indigenous Indians. And so I looked at the foods that the indigenous Indians used, what they found locally. They weren't importing, they weren't, they were gatherers and hunters and gatherers. And then I looked at, okay, well, who were the people that came in from the outside? And that was the Spanish, the French, the British, in the majority. Those are the ethnic groups. And then each of them had African slaves, or Africans, free or slave, that traveled with them. And so, okay, and the Africans, if you look at the African culinary contributions, really a lot of what is Southern food owes the majority of the reference back to the Africans. Certainly some of the ingredients were local or came in from different groups, but the Africans really made it what is Southern food today.
And the other thing you did, you released this book on the 500th anniversary, the day that we do believe is it from all the historians, the day that Juan Ponce de Leon step foot on the Florida coast and named this place we live, Florida.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's talk about what might had Ponce stayed around a little longer, and he did. You know, what sort of foods would he have found right then that the natives were eating to stay alive?
Yeah, the local foods, first off, one of the books I read said that there were basically 2,000 edible plants. What they all were, I didn't take the time to catalog, because when writing a cookbook, the goal was make it interesting, have the story be interesting, the history be interesting, but also provide recipes that people will use. And so if I go into all these esoteric ingredients, people would never cook with it.
So there are no baked bear recipes.
Well, there is.
Actually, there are bears now. What's wrong with me? Mastodon, how's that?
Yeah, but we do. Yeah. Well, we do have a recipe called bear head hash.
Oh my! But there's no bear in it.
Well, you could put bear in it, but because it's hard to come by.
Is it illegal to?
Well,
not to hunt a bear
I was actually
in
talking
certain
to someone
times.
a couple of days ago, and they said that you can get a special license to hunt bear in Florida. I thought you couldn't, but you can get bear in other parts of the country. And I went online, and even in the recipe, I say that if you want to use bear meat, it's available via the internet.
Well, I had a Florida brown bear run in front of my car last year as I was taking a drive, that beautiful drive along the Gulf where you see the Gulf splashing. I just could not bear to think someone would take that little bear out. But nonetheless,
Yeah, but the Indians were eating. Their mainstay. It's called the Three Sisters. It's corned beans and squash.
Right.
So.
And people do call it the Three Sisters, as opposed to, let's say, in New Orleans, they call it the Triumph.
There are a lot of different terms for it.
Yes.
I came across the Three Sisters in the books I was reading.
Yeah.
And those were the vegetarian aspect of the diet, the mainstay. And then there's a huge amount of, if you talk about the proteins, what meats did they eat? Possum, raccoon, bear, elk, deer, anything that you can think of. I'm sure they ate rat. I did find a Civil War era recipe, which is, my book only goes to 1821. That's when Florida becomes a U.S. territory. And so the Civil War era recipe didn't come into the book because it's out of the realm. But there was a recipe for rat, and it said to bake rat or to cook rat, make it as you would possum.
Oh, yum. I know that recipe, so we have no problems.
But the thing that I found interesting is I also found a recipe for possum, and it said make it as you would chicken.
Oh, funny.
So if you want to cook rat, I'm sure everybody's got a chicken recipe. There's your solution.
Everything eventually tastes like chicken,
That's
doesn't
right.
it? Now, in the other food, I am next to certain that the Timucua prepared would have been alligator, because there are images of them capturing gators and killing them for dining purposes, cooking purposes.
I purposefully did not. Alligator is mentioned, but there's no recipe, and that's because I've gone into so many restaurants along the First Coast, and they've all got it. Yeah. And it's the same thing. It's I can open up a can of worms. I also did not put anything in about the dado pepper. And that's because there are two historical references I found for that, and I asked a lot of people, and the answer was, well, it's not conclusive which is right. One was that the dado peppers came in with the Menorcans on the early fleets. The other is there's a story of some guy that came up from Cuba in, I think it was the 1850s. And he was just importing them as a piece of commerce.
How interesting. So
nobody could say which one was decisive. So and again, you can go into any store along the First Coast and find dado pepper jam. And so why be that common?
Well, let's do this. Let's take a look at some images of several recipes that you can prepare. People can prepare from the recipes in your book. And in fact, there's your book up on the screen now. And here come some of the images. And talk about the contributions and where you can align these with which nation.
Okay. So this one on the screen right now, this is a crab recipe. It's crab in you make a cup out of cucumber. But it's the crab, and that's the nod towards the Indians. This is the Spanish romajardies, which are a cheese-filled pastry.
Famous.
Yeah. They were brought out for various celebrations. This is the bear head hash.
Oh.
Now, we made it as a roast beef hash, but it's one of those dishes that you can use. It's like what's left over in the fridge. chop up some chicken, chop up the turkey. I mean, Thanksgiving's coming up in a few months. You know, whatever protein you want to chop up, you can throw into that, and it'll work.
Now, this one we didn't get to talk about.
This is a beef dish, and that's because the British brought beef over.
Okay.
Beef wasn't here before the British, and what a lot of people may not know, a lot of Floridians might, but pork wasn't here before the Spanish brought it up, and the pork the hogs did so well here that they thrived, and they found a way to escape the pens. And a lot of the wild razorbacks today, if you could do a genetic search, you might find that wild razorback that you caught actually is a descendant from one of the Spanish fleets.
I certainly know before town centers sprung up in the middle of North Florida here, people would tell me they would find those hogs running wild through the bush and bramble out there. So I'm wondering if they weren't descendants. Well, let's talk a little bit maybe, okay, you talked a little bit of Spanish and French contribution, well, Spanish and English contributions. What about the French contributions?
The French contribution is interesting. People know about, if you go into New Orleans and you have Cajun Creole, and it's fabulous stuff. But those were the French that settled in the Gulf. Those were the French explorations that went into that part of North America. The French that came to the first coast, that came over with Ribot and came over with de Laudonnière, they had a hard time here. They came over ill-equipped. They weren't farmers. They could shoot a gun for military reasons, but they weren't hunters. And they relied on the good graces of the Indians. The Indians were very hospitable when they first came over. Said, sure, you want this here, you want that, you're looking for some medals here. They were very gracious, but after a while, it's probably like any good guest, you know, they kind of wore on the Indians after a while. And there was a lot of infighting even amongst the Indians, and so to have infighting amongst the settlers, why not? But the settlers only survived based on the foodstuffs that the Indians provided. And it got to the point where when the French were actually were starving because their provisions had run out and the good graces of the Indians ran out, and they were doing, okay, here's one fish for one shirt. And it got very expensive. And then the Spanish were coming up and saying, wait a minute, French folk, you're trespassing on our land. And so there was the hostilities. And between bad weather and the ships being shipwrecked, and starvation, and the Spanish coming up and basically wiping everybody out.
Right. And here at La Caroline, what we now recognize as Jacksonville, that's right.
But the French failed, and so they did not bring anything from a culinary perspective. Now, at the same time, we're talking...
Not even the wine? You don't count the wine? It's said to be the first wine production in North America, but okay, we'll give them, let's give them the wine.
Okay, we can give them, but what I did is I'm going, wait a minute, the French are renowned for their culinary influence. So I said, all right, to be fair, I'm going to go back to Europe, and I'm going to find out what were they doing in the 15 and 1600s, just to give them at least some credit for something.
Right.
And it turned out that during that time, the French were the darlings of Europe. And for 300 years, they were the darlings of Europe. They were known for cooking with garlic and sauces, and to a certain degree with sweets and with cheeses and dairy. And so I brought in recipes that used the Indians' ingredients, but also used garlic or also used sugar. And so it was, you know, it was a nice gesture on my part, historically not accurate.
Well, I want to thank you for being here, and if people want to hear more, because you certainly have enjoyed this topic, and we appreciate that you've embraced this North Florida history and the culinary history with such enthusiasm, and you have. Right on to producing a book about it. I encourage people to attend a program at the Jacksonville Historical Society, and that program takes place June the 27th. That's Thursday, June the 27th, Jacksonville Historical Society, featuring Jeffrey Spear of Studio Spear, and that's your other role.
That's right. Yep.
And he'll be there to talk about the culinary history of North Florida. And I hope people stay tuned to watch it. Oh, and they can get a book signed while they're there.
Absolutely. Yep, we'll have some books available.
So that'll be very exciting. I want to thank you for a fascinating program. And I want to ask everybody to stay with us. We'll be right back with Harry Reagan with more of the Jacksonville History Show.